A cold wind whistled through the hospital's narrow hallways as Nurse Emily hurried past the rows of occupied beds. The night shift was always exhausting, but tonight something weighed heavier on her heart than usual. She clutched the clipboard in her hand, glancing down at the name scrolled across the top. Liam Carter, age 6. The little boy had been admitted earlier that evening, his tiny body burning with fever, his breathing shallow. His mother, a frail woman in worn-out clothes, had been sitting by his bedside, her hands trembling as she stroked his damp forehead. Emily had seen that look before. The quiet panic of a parent who knew they couldn't afford the treatment their child desperately needed. Emily had tried to reassure the woman, but she could see the hopelessness in her eyes. The doctors had prescribed an urgent course of medication, but without payment, the hospital couldn't proceed. Liam's mother had quietly asked for time to gather the money, but Emily knew that time was a luxury the boy didn't have. She had walked away from that bedside, feeling a knot tighten in her stomach. She couldn't shake the thought of that small, feverish child, struggling to breathe. The hospital had rules, strict ones about payments and treatment, but Emily had never been one to let bureaucracy stand in the way of a life. After pacing the hallway for what felt like an eternity, she made her decision. She pulled out her purse, fingers trembling slightly as she counted the bills inside. It wasn't much, but it was enough to cover the treatment. With a deep breath, she made her way to the billing desk and quietly handed over the money. "Are you sure about this?" the receptionist asked, raising an eyebrow. Emily nodded. "Just process it, please." The woman hesitated for a moment before finally entering the payment into the system. Emily let out a small sigh of relief. Liam would get his treatment. That was all that mattered. But what she didn't know was that someone had been watching. Across the waiting area, a man in an expensive suit sat silently, his eyes fixed on Emily. He had arrived at the hospital earlier that evening for a private matter, but now his attention was entirely on the nurse, who had just handed over her own money to save a child. There was something in the way she had done it, without hesitation, without expecting anything in return, that made him pause. He had seen acts of charity before, but this felt different. There was a sincerity to it, an urgency that went beyond simple kindness. The man leaned back in his chair, thoughtful. He had spent years surrounded by wealth and privilege. But tonight, sitting in this hospital, he was reminded of something he had nearly forgotten: the raw, unfiltered goodness that still existed in the world. He watched as Emily returned to the child's bedside, gently placing a cool cloth on his forehead, whispering reassurances to his mother. A small smile played at the corner of the man's lips. He had come to the hospital for one reason, but now he had another. He had seen something in that nurse, something rare, and in that moment he made a decision of his own. Tomorrow he would find her, and he would make her an offer that would change her life forever. The next morning, Emily barely had time to catch her breath before the day shift started. She had spent most of the night checking on Liam, making sure his fever was going down, reassuring his mother that everything would be okay. But deep down, she worried. She had covered the cost of his treatment this time. But what about tomorrow? What if the boy needed more care? She didn't have the kind of money to keep paying out of pocket, and the hospital's policies weren't likely to bend for long. As she hurried through the ward, adjusting IV drips and checking charts, she didn't notice the man from the waiting area approaching. He stood quietly by the nurse's station, watching her work. He had spent the night thinking about what he had seen, replaying the moment in his mind. The way she had given away her own money without hesitation, the quiet determination in her eyes. He had been in many hospitals before, surrounded by doctors and staff who followed the rules, but she was different. She had acted from the heart. Finally, he stepped forward. "Excuse me," he said, his voice calm but firm. Emily turned, startled. She was used to dealing with patients and worried families. But there was something different about this man. His suit was perfectly tailored. His watch gleamed under the fluorescent lights. He didn't look like someone who belonged in this part of the hospital. "Can I help you?" she asked, brushing a strand of hair from her face. The man gave a small smile. "I believe you already have. I saw what you did last night. For the boy, Liam," Emily stiffened. She wasn't sure what to say. Had she broken some kind of rule? Was this man from hospital administration? "You paid for his treatment," he continued. "Out of your own pocket." Emily swallowed hard. "I couldn't just stand by and do nothing. He needed help." The man nodded, as if he had expected that answer. "That's exactly why I want to talk to you." He glanced around the busy ward before lowering his voice. "Would you mind stepping outside for a moment?" Emily hesitated. She didn't have time for distractions, but something about the way he spoke made her curious. She glanced toward Liam's bed. He was resting peacefully, his mother asleep in the chair beside him. Taking a deep breath, she nodded. Outside the hospital doors, the air was crisp, the morning sun cutting through the cold. Emily crossed her arms, suddenly feeling out of place next to this man who seemed so composed, like someone who had never worried about a bill in his life. "My name is Daniel Carter," he said. "I run a foundation that helps fund medical treatments for children in need." Emily's eyes widened. "You're with a charity, something like that," he said, studying her. "I won't waste your time, so I'll get straight to the point. I've been looking for people like you, people who care enough to act when no one else will. What you did last night, most wouldn't have." Emily let out a nervous laugh. "It wasn't a big deal." Daniel shook his head. "No, it was. And I'd like to offer you something. A position with my foundation. We help provide medical care to children who can't afford it, but we need people on the inside. Nurses, doctors, people who understand the system." He hesitated before adding, "People like you." Emily's heart pounded. It sounded too good to be true. "You want me to work for you?" "Yes. And I'll be honest, it won't be easy. You'll be dealing with tough cases, heartbreaking situations, but you'll also have the resources to actually make a difference. You won't have to pay out of pocket ever again." Emily didn't know what to say. She had spent years feeling trapped, watching families struggle, wanting to help but never having the means. Now, out of nowhere, this stranger was offering her a chance to do exactly that. "But why me?" she asked. Daniel smiled. "Because I can see it in you. You won't turn away when someone needs help. That's rare." Emily looked away, unsure. A part of her wanted to say yes, to jump at the chance to make a bigger impact. But another part of her hesitated. This hospital was her home. She had built a life here. Could she really walk away? Before she could answer, a voice called her name from the entrance. It was another nurse, her face pale with urgency. "Emily, you need to come now, it's Liam." Her stomach dropped. Without another word, she turned and ran back inside. Emily's heart pounded as she rushed back into the hospital. The moment she stepped inside, she could hear the frantic beeping of Liam's monitor. His tiny body trembled, his skin paler than before. His mother clutched his hand, tears streaming down her face as she whispered his name over and over. "What happened?" Emily asked, pushing past the nurses. "His fever spiked again," the doctor said grimly. "We need to move fast." Emily barely hesitated. Before springing into action, she grabbed a fresh IV bag, adjusting his fluids. Her hands steady, despite the chaos. The doctors worked quickly, administering stronger medication, fighting to stabilize the boy's condition. Liam's breaths came in shallow gasps, his body burning up, but Emily refused to let panic take over. "Come on, sweetheart," she whispered, pressing a cool cloth to his forehead. "Just hold on." Minutes felt like hours. Then, finally the beeping on the monitor began to steady. Liam's breathing evened out, his tiny chest rising and falling in a more natural rhythm. The tension in the room slowly eased, replaced by cautious relief. Emily let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Liam's mother collapsed into a chair, sobbing, this time out of relief. Emily squeezed her hand, offering a reassuring nod. "He's going to be okay." As the other nurses and doctors left to attend to other patients, Emily stayed by Liam's bedside, watching the slow rise and fall of his breathing. She felt exhausted, but also something else, something deeper. She had done everything she could within the limits of this hospital, but it had almost not been enough. A quiet voice broke her thoughts. "You didn't leave." Emily turned to see Daniel standing at the doorway, watching her. She exhaled, shaking her head. "I couldn't." Daniel studied her for a moment before stepping forward. "And that's exactly why I need you." Emily glanced at Liam, then back at Daniel. The weight of everything, the exhaustion, the endless fight to help patients who couldn't afford care, settled on her shoulders. She had spent years trying to do the right thing, but she had also spent years feeling helpless. Maybe this was her chance to change that. Taking a deep breath, she met Daniel's gaze. "Okay," she said. "I'm in." A slow smile spread across his face. "You won't regret it." For the first time in a long time, Emily felt hope, not just for herself, but for every child like Liam who deserved a chance to live. She reached for Liam's tiny hand, giving it one last reassuring squeeze before stepping out of the hospital room, ready to begin a new chapter, one where she could truly make a difference.